So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Idea Week. Here we are, Friday of Idea Week. Let's see some energy, right? Yes. Just miraculous that this amazing event was pulled off with such little time, and the engagement, the quality of speakers. Hopefully you all have been able to connect with one another and share ideas and thoughts and be inspired. And I think this morning should leave you nowhere less than super inspired and excited. So my name's Amish Shah. I am the CEO of a company called Chemcrest. I am a Notre Dame MBA and an entrepreneur. I have exited many companies, started many companies, and I have a fund. And so I guess I thought that I knew what I was doing, and then I was asked to introduce Ali, and I'm reading his bio, and I recognize that I'm like in junior high JV, and when I grow up, I want to be Ali. So that's really cool to have somebody that you'd like to model. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker this morning, and it's wonderful, wonderful to have him in the room. Ali Tamaseb is a partner at Data Collective, a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley with over $2 billion under management and investments in more than $10 billion in startups. He holds multiple leadership and board of director positions at companies across the United States and globally. He holds a degree in biomedical engineering from the Imperial College in London and studied general management at Stanford Graduate School of Business. I hope he's still a Notre Dame football fan. Ali was an honoree of the British Alumni Award of 2018 by the British Council, and he received the Imperial College President's Medal for Outstanding Achievement. Ali's work has been featured on the BBC, in the Guardian, Forbes, Fortune, the Telegraph, and other media outlets. And he has given talks and appeared on panels at major events and conferences. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Please, big Notre Dame welcome for Ali.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, good morning. How's your day going? Thank you for coming this early in the morning. Well, Amish did a great job in introduction. What I will be talking about today is this project that I started working on about 6 years ago. So before becoming a VC, I was an entrepreneur. I started 2 companies before. I had seen my own fair share of success and failure. And then I moved to the dark side, the venture capital side. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if somebody had collected data on every startup that's ever been created and just compared them. 99.99% of companies fail or don't get, to a big success, and that very, very small sliver of them become these billion-dollar companies that we know them. And, what is it that separates? Is it 100% luck? Or, I believe a good part of this is luck. But other than that, is there something that separates these 2 group of companies, the very successful ones, and the majority of the rest that don't ever get to that point? And I looked around. I spent months just looking around, and there's some academic studies that have tried to look at, what is different and what separates them. But they may look at it and they may include their laundromat as a startup, which it's a small business, but it's not the same thing as what you want to look at as a tech investor. So that's what I started doing. I spent 4.5 years collecting this data set. This is the largest data set ever collected on startups. 65 data points per company. Background of the founders, what they had done before, where they had worked, what they studied, where they went, where the idea came from, what the competitive landscape looked like, pivots, market dynamics, market size, all the way to fundraising. How much did they raise? Who did they raise from? How fast? What valuation? So I crunched all this together for all these companies, and then this small part of them that had become these massive multi-billion-dollar outcomes. And the results fascinated me. There's a lot of things that were counterintuitive, or things that even surprised me as a professional full-time investor. So I decided to put this whole thing into a book, and to make it, to add some stories and some color to the cold data, I interviewed a ton of people, founders of big companies like Zoom and GitHub and Nest, and investors in Sequoia Capital and Founders Fund. So I put the whole thing together and wrote this book, came out last May. So today I'm going to talk about some of the things that I learned in this process of crunching this data and talking with these fascinating people. So now I want you to imagine the founder of a unicorn company right when they're starting that company. What comes to your mind? Probably not this one. It's probably something like this. An undergrad, a 19-year-old college dropout out of Harvard, or, an Ivy League school, because that's the stories we've heard. That's Mark Zuckerberg, that's Bill Gates, that's a lot of these big successful founders. Now, I want this talk to be interactive, so I'll be asking a bunch of questions. And the first question I want to ask is, what percentage of the founders of billion-dollar companies, right when they were starting that company, not now, when they were starting that company, what percentage of them do you think were below the age of 23? Anyone want to take a guess? 50%. 2%. Very different. Any more? 80%? Okay. 100. Great guesses, but bad guesses. The median age was 34, and less than 5%, so only 4% of founders of billion-dollar companies were under the age of 23. Now, the reason you may ask, okay, why there's this big disconnect? And the reason is media. You go on TechCrunch, you go on media, and these are the stories that get covered. It's not, it's not an information. It's not something unique that TechCrunch would write. Hey, look at this 43-year-old entrepreneur doing this. Like, that's not something they'll put in the title. As soon as they're 19, look at this 19-year-old entrepreneur, and that's what skews the mindset. It's only 4%. The median age is 34. The other 96% were older than 23 when they started. But, so I had the two distributions, right? I have the unicorns and I have the average startup. When I compared them, the two distributions looked similar. So when you do statistical tests on them, I actually realized age is a non-factor. So being younger or older on itself is not a factor. It does not contribute to success or failure of startups. So, this is probably more or less what these founders, some of them look like. Anybody knows who this person is? This founder is? I'll give you a clue. For those of you who are, recently studying, this is the person who, enabled you to skip school like this. The founder of Zoom, Eric Yuan, founder of Zoom. So Eric was a solo founder, right? He started a company solo, typically frowned upon. You go to competitions, you go to any advisor and say, well, first thing you do, you find a co-founder. First thing you do, you come back to me when you have your other person. And the reason is, like, we've seen a ton of these companies. Microsoft, Google, a lot of these companies, Apple, they were started by two co-founders, and that's what shapes that perception. Anyone want to take a guess what percentage of unicorn companies were started by solo founders? 10%? Less than 5? 30? 60? Okay. The answer is 20%. So 1 out of every 5 unicorn was started by a solo founder. And this is something you would not expect. And a lot of, it's still not the majority. The majority is still 2. But again, when I looked at the two numbers, the unicorns and the non-unicorns, again, this is a non-factor. The number of co-founders that you have by itself does not contribute to your success or failure. So if you have to start a company and it's you, that's fine. If you have all the skills, that's fine. And if you have 5 other people, that you need to have, Alibaba, I think, had 18 co-founders. So there are companies in all parts of this range, and just because we've seen the 2 co-founders more frequently doesn't mean that leads to more or less success. Anybody knows this person? Probably not. This is Jason Citron. He's founder of Discord. Anyone use Discord? It's a great alternative to Slack. It's a communication platform for communities. And it's a great company. I think $15 billion company at this point. Anyone want to take a guess which university he attended? He graduated from? Not Notre Dame. No, not nearby. So he attended a small, probably a little known university in Southern Florida, not even in a top 100 schools, right? And that's kind of next question. We've heard about people going to Harvard and Stanford and Ivy Leagues. What percentage of unicorn founders do you think went to a top 10 school? Less than 10%. What else? 1%. What else? Now I don't want to skew you toward the wrong. Think about your conception. 25. Okay, but you're getting close. So the correct answer is 35. So almost one out of every 3 unicorn founder went to a top 10 school. So obviously this was a contributing factor. Going to a good school was, 10 schools produce 1/3 of these unicorns. So this was a contributing factor. This was an important factor. However, there's this long range. 65% of unicorn founders did not go to a top 10 school. So a lot of founders were able to start companies, regardless of where they started, what they studied, where they studied. Now, there's a lot of other factors that contributed to their success. I will talk about them towards the end of the talk, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Things, when I looked at the data, more than the academic rank of the school, something that really mattered was location and the entrepreneurial culture of that school. If other people have started companies, that hype, that role models get started. So that's why Stanford is like right on the top. Those role models are there, and then it's in the location. But like even when you look at San Jose State University, not a top-ranking school by any means, but there's a ton of unicorn founders that came out of San Jose State just because it's in Silicon Valley. There's other schools that not necessarily academically top, but they're in the right location or they have the right entrepreneurial culture. That's kind of where I think universities like what exactly is being done here. Cultivate that culture, get the role models out, and see that cycle get going. This is Ari Beldergren. I had an opportunity to interview him for the book. This is chapter 4 of the book. He started 2 companies, 2 biotech companies. One of them $9 billion, one of them I think $5 billion now. So he started $2 billion companies in the pharma biotech space. And he had reached the pinnacle of the academic world. He is like everything you want to imagine. He has master's, MD, PhD. He was a professor. He was a very, very top professor. He was leading departments at UCLA. And then he kind of left that and started these companies, and massive successful companies. Anyone want to take now it's a battle. Professors or dropouts? Which one do we have more of among unicorns? the 2 ends of the spectrum. Dropouts. Professors. Okay, the answer is professors. By a slight, 1%, 2%. So not necessarily statistically, very significant, but that's the answer. So the most common is like, 1/3 of these founders, they had just done a bachelor's and then worked a bunch and started that company. Then the second most common was MBAs. When I compare the 2 distributions, actually, the people who had MBAs had a slight chance, improved chance on starting billion-dollar companies. Now motivations and everything else. Then it's masters, PhDs, and then the rest of the list. But again, when you look at the data, degree by itself was not necessarily a strong statistical factor in like entrepreneurial success. These are 2 of my friends, Martin, Mehdi, and Massi. They're in Canada. There are 3 brothers that started this company called Applyboard. There's a company in Canada in the education technology in the education space. I think $3 billion company now. One thing that comes very common, you go on Quora and a bunch of forums, is this question: if co-founders are immediate family members, your brothers, father and son, whatever, does it affect the team's ability to raise funding? Does it impact their ability to succeed? And that's, it's probably a little bit taboo in the venture world in, investing in family members. It kind of feels like, family businesses, not startups. But again, when I looked at the data, there's a ton of examples of companies started by family members. After all, this is how companies were started, for a long time. People who trust each other, people who are going to have less likelihood of running into conflict. So there's many examples of companies, Eventbrite and VMware. They were started by couples. There are some companies started by father and sons. So again, that's not, when you look at the data, it's not something, it's not bad, it's not good, but it's not something that you should, pass on investing or pass on the opportunity of starting that company just because, two people are family members. Here is another interesting story. This is another interview that I did for the book. This is Nat Turner and Zach Weinberg. They started a company called Flatiron Health. This is a company in the oncology space, real world evidence, and they sold that company to Roche for $2 billion. Want to guess what their background was? Like what they studied, what industry they worked in? Computer science. Okay, that was one guess. Finance. Okay. Not medicine. Biochemistry. Okay. So the answer is they studied actually business. Their previous company was an advertising company. They started an ad tech company and they sold that to Google for $80 million. And then they started this company in oncology space, like totally irrelevant, not in the same space. Like nobody would fund this big of a move, right? What do you know about cancer that you want to take on Roche? In the first 10 people, there was nobody from the medical world, right? They had to learn this. Now, when I talked to them, what enabled them to go and do this, they told me about, having sold that first company, that gave them a lot of legitimacy, a lot of resources that they could go in and walk into hospitals, show the Google card, talk about their previous experience and talk about, we want to bring this amazing technical team to this space that's not been disrupted before, to your, hospitals. And that's what enabled them to, go and talk to these doctors, get these resources, talk to the FDA. Their resourcefulness, their connections, their network is what enabled them to build and sell this company for $2 billion, not their deep knowledge in oncology or cancer or, real world evidence. They invented this field of real world evidence. Now, here's when I looked at the pairing of, how much, industry experience they had among the founders. So actually in health and biotech, they were the exception. About 80% of the founders did come from that background. They knew what they were doing. They didn't just come and learn it. But in enterprise companies and in consumer companies, it was very common to see founders jumping from one industry to another or not having experience within that industry. So especially in consumer space, and even in enterprise, 60% of these founders did not come from the same industry. Doesn't mean they didn't have work experience. As we saw, they were 34 years old immediately. They had worked in different companies. They may have started companies before. It wasn't necessarily in the same thing. They may start from a data, infrastructure company and go to insurance technology. They may start from agriculture technology and go into, e-commerce or doing something else. So we see a lot of these shifts. And again, the point is, it's these soft skills, it's these resourcefulness, it's a network that matters. It's not necessarily, you can hire for that, and you can, if you're good enough, you can learn that, like Elon Musk. What did he know about rockets and terrain and tunnels? And look at what he's done now, right? It's about having the resources and having, wanting to go deep and learn about these things, not necessarily about already knowing that space or coming from that industry. Here's another great story. Rachel Carlson. She started a company called Guild Education, multi-billion-dollar company. It's in, again, education space. What they do, they work with companies like Starbucks and Disney. They enable them to give education, college education, to their employees, which helps them retain talent and helps them develop their talent base. Now, a lot of companies, a lot of successful startups move to Silicon Valley, right? After they're able to raise some funding or whatever, Silicon Valley used to be the place to be. This company started, 7, 8, 10 years ago. So she did the exact reverse. She was a Stanford alumni. She was living there. And then they moved the company to Denver. Now, the reason is this company, like a lot of companies, had a service layer, right? The service layer for this company is the coaches they had for these students. So they had to have engineers, and they have had to have these coaches. And it's very hard as a startup to be able to pay these coaches enough money so that they can live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is very expensive. So instead of dividing the company into two pieces, hey, this is HQ, this is engineers, and we have coaches living somewhere else, she decided to move and hire the engineers somewhere that she can pay both groups, because she wanted to have everybody in the same place. She wanted to have the culture to include the coaches, the engineers, the finance people, everybody be in the same place. And that's why she moved to Denver. Now, a lot of her investors, they invested in a company in Silicon Valley, and now she's there and telling, I'm actually moving to Denver, which at the time didn't have any strong entrepreneurial hub. And the way she convinced the board, very interesting. So she posted a job for a VP of engineering, and both in San Francisco and in Denver, and collected a bunch of people who applied and took it to the board, anonymized the location, and let the board, hey, investors, board, you pick who should I hire. And they picked a couple people, and all of them were living in Denver. The reason, they were, $1 million seed startup company in San Francisco. Nobody would come and, leave their Google job for a seed stage startup. In Denver, they were able to hire people who had a lot more experience and people who were able to hire a team and, be better. And, with a salary that was competitive for a seed stage startup. So that's what convinced the board to move the company to Denver. Can you guess what percentage of these unicorn companies were started in Silicon Valley? Want to take a guess? 2/3, okay. 33, okay. So somewhere between 33% to 66%, which is correct. About half of these companies were started in Silicon Valley, and half of them were not. There was a slight advantage for companies that started in Silicon Valley. Now, this is a study that goes all the way back to 2005. At this day and age, 2022, a lot of companies are remote. A lot of companies are distributed. I don't think this holds anymore, but this was the story. A lot of, coastal companies, but still, you see a lot of successful companies that started in other states as well, and they were, fewer companies were started and fewer companies were successful, but you still saw about 50% of companies being able to be, massive billion-dollar, $10 billion companies outside of Silicon Valley. Next, I'll go and talk about the source of the idea. We've heard about, you should the different ways that you should generate your startup idea, or what is a worthy idea to have. And a lot of times we hear about solving a personal problem. I don't know if you've heard of this, but when you talk to advisors, when you go hear these talks, a lot of people talk about you should solve a personal problem. You should be visionary about what you do. And I crunched the numbers, and it didn't seem like that is the correct thing to do. A lot of times the stories change. So I had to go to the very first interview that these founders did, or ask them, honestly, tell me, was this a personal problem to you or not? And it turns out these things make for a great story. You talk to a journalist and you want to, create the dot. Looking back, you want to connect the dots, and you talk about how this idea that you're working on now was a visionary thing for you, something that you cared about for a long time, or was a personal problem to you. And it kind of makes for a good story, and it makes sense that if you solve a personal problem, you can solve it better. But in reality, ideas started in a gazillion different ways. Some were coming to you when you were working in a big company. A lot of them were pivots. Some, like, if everybody worked on a personal problem, we would have had, and we still have, a ton of companies, a ton of apps that would solve parking for you, or now you see a ton of 10-minute delivery companies. Nobody would work on climate change, on agriculture, on weather prediction, on these big problems that are global challenges. Each of them hundreds of billions of dollars market, trillions of dollars of market, and those are the problems that are worth solving for. And that's the kind of companies that I hope to invest and hope to be able to support. So now I'll talk about some of these interesting stories that I come across in how companies were formed. This is an app called Bourbon. Kind of like, you go somewhere and it kind of looks like Foursquare. If you'd used it before, you kind of, tag where you went, maybe post a picture. A couple guys started this company and, ran it for a couple months. Didn't work. Nobody was using it. What they did, they stripped down the features. Instead of where you were able to kind of tag it and all these things, the only thing that was left was you can post a picture. That company became Instagram. So, a lot of times good ideas come from reducing features from an original idea to going to the exactly one thing that matters to the users. Now they've expanded obviously a bunch from them, but the way they started initially was better filters, quick camera, put it out there, and at the time it was like 24 hours. Anybody want to take a guess what this company is today? This is YouTube. YouTube started as a dating website. The idea was you would upload your video talking about yourself, And obviously nobody did that. Kind of felt awkward. So people started uploading their videos of their cat or something cute. That's how YouTube formed. So this time around, the founders had an idea, bandwidth is coming, broadband is good, we can now upload videos, we can now watch videos. This is a trend that we want to capture. What is something that comes to our mind? Dating. They tried it, but they were open to the user. They listened back to the users and say, okay, maybe we were wrong. We should not push on that. People want to upload their cat videos. Let them upload their cat videos. That's how YouTube was formed. Another example, Neha and her two co-founders, they started this company called Confluent. It's in the data business space, very successful company. The story of how this company was created, she was working at LinkedIn, one of the early engineers at LinkedIn, on their data problems, and they had this problem of how to move the data around and how to update it, because they were dealing with hundreds of millions of data points very fast. They wanted to be able to apply, update this data points, very frequently at larger scale. So they started developing this open source project at LinkedIn, and they developed it, and that's how they ended up starting Confluent. They came out, they received some investment from LinkedIn itself. The project was open source, so LinkedIn didn't have much of a IP problem with it, and they ended up starting this company. And this is actually one very frequent way that a lot of enterprise companies get started. You're working at a large corporate company, you see a problem, you solve a engineering problem that's not necessarily the core thing to LinkedIn. It's data and network. It's not a code base. So a lot of these companies, in order to be able to retain talent, let you open source these projects and create a community. But they do this, and a lot of people start using that open source project. They come out and they start a company. So a lot of different ways that startup companies were created. Many of these were not necessarily personal problems of one person in their personal life. Now we'll talk about timing, market cycles. Some people may remember Webvan. This is what DoorDash and Instacart do today, 22 years ago. And this company went bust in the .com era. And I want to talk about this idea of market cycles. A lot of ideas are recycled ideas. It's not necessarily important to be the first to market. It's not necessarily important to be novel. Like a lot of times, this idea was tried before 5 times and never succeeded. So what? Maybe this time it does. Now, as an entrepreneur, it's very lazy to say, okay, it does. You have to know why it works this time. You have to go and talk to those people. You have to understand what changed in the market, what changed in the market dynamic and the competitive landscape and all these things. But just the fact that a company has failed before doing one thing is not at all a reason it's not going to work anymore. In fact, when you look at the data, a lot of companies, the majority, the 40%, they were not even the first 5 times that one idea was tried. So the idea failed for 5 times and then succeeded after 15 years. Tony Fadell, another interview in the book, he worked in a company called General Magic, 1993. They started building smartphones. Didn't work. Battery technology wasn't there. Touchscreen wasn't there. Company raised a ton of money. It failed. Then he went into Philips to start that division. Didn't work out. 5 years later, he joined Apple. And he started, there they worked on this project. So 12 years later, finally iPhone came out. And this is the project that 1% tried, failed twice, and the third time around, it's known by Steve Jobs, but there's people inside Apple who built that product that, came out and started this company. So we talked about a lot of things that did not matter to this point. Now I want to talk to you about what does actually matter. Did your data show anything that, actually can help me do something useful? One thing that mattered a lot was where you worked. The network that you built, the legitimacy that you built, the kind of, people that you can hire, people who you can sell to. If you work in a tier 1 company, those are Google, McKinsey, Goldman, the big companies, even for a couple years, they are really helpful in building your network, in building the relationships, and just learning what these big companies look like, how you sell to them, what are the problems and what are the challenges they have. That's one important thing. It's a list of some companies that came out most. Now again, this study goes back all the way to 2005, so companies like IBM and Oracle come up now. But if you go and look at the more recent batch, it's companies like Square and Twitter, and those are the companies that now the next generation of startup founders come from. So one thing is, working in a company with, great engineers around you, or great, generally people around you. Now, the second thing, I will talk about this fascinating story. Anybody has ever seen this thing? It's called the $1 Million Homepage. It's an old thing, I think 2005. This is before kind of the whole, ad space was developed or as mature as today. This guy, university undergraduate, built this project. The idea was, I will put this website 1 million pixels by 1 million pixels, and I will rent it out, I think $1 per pixel, and companies can just put whatever they want in as many pixels as they buy, and there's like 10 by 10 pixels minimum that you can buy. So $10 you can go minimum, and this just started generating a lot of buzz. And this is a time that, if you do this today, it's not going to generate buzz. People are going to say, well, what is this thing? Maybe it still does. But, a lot of people were curious about it. A lot of magazines wrote about it. And people just started coming out, okay, what is this $1 million homepage? And just because people came to it, advertisers came to it as well. So people started paying money to put their website logo up there. And that's it. He made $1 million. It's not a company. It's not an exit. It's nothing, right? He started a project, made some money online. He moved on. 7 years later, he started this company called Calm. He failed one company in between, and then he started this company called Calm. If you use it, the meditation space, couple $1 billion company. A lot of people use it. Fantastic app. And where it started was from that project, from learning to build and sell something and make some money online. It wasn't necessarily a company. It wasn't an exit. He was not a serial entrepreneur. Built something. In fact, the next company failed. Was the company after that became this massive $1 billion company. Another interview that I did, founders of Brex. So Brex is, again, multi-billion-dollar company in the kind of banking space, in the card issuing space, mostly for small, medium businesses, for startups. And they were super young. They were, again, Stanford dropouts. And now we're going back to that kind of, 4% that I'm telling you, even those 4% are not normal. They had done things before, even they were 20. So they started Brex when they were 20 or 21. But before that, when they were high school kids, they had started this company, this project in Brazil, in the banking space. They were helping, the central bank with some APIs and, going around. And one of the co-founders, Francesco, he was a jailbreaker. He was jailbreaking iPhones. So, he started a lot of stuff. They made some money. They've started, this project. They sold that, little company back in Brazil. They moved to Stanford. They thought, okay, it's kind of boring. Left it. They started a virtual reality company. They joined Y Combinator. Started a virtual reality company. Say, okay, kind of doesn't make sense. And then they started this company, Brex, and now it's a $1 billion, $10 billion company. So again, even these founders, they had started something before. They have, made some money online or in whatever way. Even the 19-year-old had done something before that. So these are the characters that build your network, creates that muscle. Just start building something, start selling something. This kind of doesn't come as a surprise. The repeat founders were more likely to start billion-dollar companies. Almost 60% of unicorn founders, it was not their first time. And even for the first-time founders, for people, again, like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg that we think are first-time founders, Bill Gates, Microsoft wasn't his first company. The first company was a company called Chat-O-Data. It was in the business of counting the number of cars that pass intersection. It was selling the data to municipalities. He was a high school kid, but he started that company. Same thing for Zuckerberg. We'll go to that. Founders of Uber, young 30s people, founders, and you would think, these founders came up with, this genius idea for an app that worked, and, they got lucky. But you go to their background. Travis had started a company, had started two companies. One out of, undergraduate at UCLA that failed. The company got sued by a ton of, big media companies in Los Angeles. The second company he started, was a long, hard, he had a lot of problems. He went bankrupt almost a couple times. He had to move into his parents. He had to move in, go and live in Thailand. Eventually, he, grinded that stage enough and was able to sell that company to Akamai for $25 million. And that's when he started Uber. And Garrett Camp, his other co-founder, same story with StumbleUpon, a company like Pinterest. Before that, he sold that company for $75 million. They came together and they started Uber. They invested, or they thought about this company. They didn't join it. They hired a person to run it. And then they, okay, kind of works. Let us join full time. Travis kind of was named co-founder and became CEO and started Uber. Now, obviously a big company. So this is again a story. This is not necessarily your genius moment in a dorm room that you come up with a genius idea and things work. In reality, a lot of companies are like this. People who have grinded before, who have failed, who have succeeded, go on, join each other and start another company, and that becomes the very successful company that there is. So these are multiple stages to getting to that point. There might be a small success in the beginning, or might be a couple failures in the beginning before going to that big outcome. And even some of them had as many as 4, successful startups, not super successful. They might have been like a $10 million outcome before starting that massive multi-billion-dollar company. Now, $10 million is a lot of money, but in the venture capital world, these a lot of these would be considered failures or very small successes because we are in the business of bees. Next story, Stripe. Again, they were mega billionaires before the age of 30. They started this massive fintech company, and a lot of people, even their investors, I talked to their investors, and even they thought, okay, first-time founders, they got lucky or whatever. They did not. They had to start a company before this when they were even younger, and they sold that company to a public company in Canada. It was a tool that helped people on eBay better run their auctions. It was called Auctionmatic. They sold that company immediately after they started Stripe, and that's how Stripe became the successful company that it is today. Even Zuckerberg, again, first-time founder or looks like a first-time founder, but he had done a bunch of projects before. You've seen the Social Network movie. Half of it is not correct, half of it is. But he's done a bunch of projects before. He built a project that looks like Spotify back in 1999 that Microsoft wanted to acquire for almost $1 million when he was a high school kid. It had AI to detect the taste of your music, 1999. He had built that. Microsoft wanted to buy that, and then later on he started Facebook. So what I want to encourage you today, the moral of the story is keep on building. If you want to become successful, build stuff, sell stuff, even if it's a small scale, even if you fail, even if nothing happens in the first try or the second try. Keep on building. There was stories about 19-year-old kid who goes on and starts Facebook. Those are the exception, and even that they had done a bunch of things before. So do the same thing, copy the pattern, build the stuff, sell it, repeat, and you'll be on your way on building your billion-dollar company and becoming a super founder. Thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you. And I'll, any questions you have, you can send to that. I don't know. You can ask it as well, whatever you want. Sure. It could. I don't have data on that specifically, but many of the examples that I saw was these short stints. So you do a project, smaller success in a couple years, and then you're off to your next project. And that's a lot of these cycles and patterns that I saw. But there's a ton of, I've seen examples that they stayed on for 5 years or 6 years. And then they went on and they worked at Google for 3 years, and then they started coming out. So I've seen a lot of people with those 8-9 year cycle on one company. Seen probably less of those if you have worked in one company for 20 years and then start the next one. So you wanted to ask a question? Ooh. Okay, so the question was, what percentage of these founders were married or stayed married before starting the company? I don't know. It's very hard to find that that data. I'm not going to ask people about this question, so I don't know the answer. Just by a lot of these for example, Guild Education, right? Rachel Carlson, she was married before. She is still married, I hope. And she had her first kid and second kid during the early years of the startup. So there's examples of very successful male and female founders going through that process, having kids, being married, getting married during the startup, before it or after, having a good life and going on. But it's very hard to have quantitative data on that fact. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Sure. Thank you. Okay. So, question is, what is your advice for a undergraduate student who just received a great offer from a Fortune 100 company for a job, but wants to be an entrepreneur, take the job or not? That's a hard question. I would say start building that thing, and the situation is different for a lot of people, right? Sometimes you have debt. You have to go and work and start repaying that debt. But there's a lot of different situations. So depending on that, I would say it's good to start building and have that building mindset. But it wouldn't hurt to go in and work for 6 months or a year in a big company, put that logo on your resume, see how they work, maybe hire a couple people from there, just see how inefficient these large corporates are and what is your advantage as a startup in terms of speed. It's like it helps being there. Don't go and stay there for 10 years. Go stay there for a year and meanwhile build your company. I am going to take this. Makes things easier. What is one piece of data you wanted for your analysis but couldn't get your hands on? That's a very good question. Socioeconomic background. So I wanted to know how wealthy their parents were. And it's a hard question to get. You could make some guesses based on what schools they went in and on, but you cannot necessarily quantify it. My guess, just from reading a lot of these stories and doing a lot of these interviews, that there is a lot of these founders came from money. So, and I think that's one of the things that I hope gets solved. Like we talk a lot about diversity problems among founders, racial, gender diversity, and those are very hard problems to solve. But I would like to add the third one, which is socioeconomic diversity. We don't have enough of that, and I think if that gets solved, the first two things would also probably help get solved. So I just hope we get to the point that startups are becoming cheaper. Hopefully education is not becoming cheaper, but hopefully there will be alternatives for paying that debt or paying for the education, or alternative ways of education, things that would enable people to go on and start these projects and start companies as soon as they can, and just start a process of grinding and failing. Dan has asked, can you talk more about how you got all this data? Do you know all these founders personally? And did writing the book spark an impactful connections for you? So the data, and this was the hard thing. That's why it took 4.5 years. It's very hard to get your hands on data. It was a lot of scraping involved. It was a lot of reading interviews, a lot of just going back, listening to early podcasts, reading the news points, using the internet, archive machines, going back in the time, and talking to the founders. I'm in a fortunate position as a venture capitalist that a lot of people would talk to me. So I would talk to a lot of these founders and ask them about their early days and gather this data, the parts that I was missing, but also a lot of automation, a lot of using of LinkedIn and Crunchbase and PitchBook and a lot of different resources. Did writing the book create any impactful relationship? 100%. You know, a lot of these investors, a lot of these founders, very successful founders that I had a chance to interview, you know, we've started doing a lot of work together. We're investing with each other. So, you know, that's been very helpful. How many founders received their initial funding from friends and family versus a loan or other types of funding? Friends and family. Yeah, a lot of people have very wealthy friends and families. I looked into the data in terms of funding, and it's very apparent that companies that were able to raise more funding at faster cadence, they became more successful. So, you know, in venture, it's really not the same mentality that you may have in the stock market. It's not about value investing that like buy low, you know, sell high. That doesn't exist in startups. You kind of buy high, sell much higher. That's a mentality. So you may invest in a company that, you know, 2 people, 1 idea, and $10 million valuation. Obviously, that's, you know, buying very high for nothing, for a piece of paper. But you know that they will start creating value and generate hundreds of millions of dollars of, you know, profits. And when you sell that company for, you know, $10 billion, that's, you know, that's buy high and sell higher. So again, when I looked in the data and compared the 2 distributions, these founders who ended up becoming very successful, they were able to raise more money. They were able to raise money from better branded investors. They were able to raise money at higher valuations. They were able to raise money at a faster cadence. So all of these, you know, these are not causation, correlation. The first chapter of the whole book is, you know, a lot of these things that I talk about, there's this causality, you know, relationship doesn't statistically exist there. A lot of it may be, you know, it was a good idea and a good team, so they got funded, so it became a good company. So the cycle kind of goes around and around. So kind of going back to the question, what percentage came from friends and family? You know, it really depends. A lot of people label that as friends and family, and you know, if you come to Silicon Valley, a lot of, you know, people raise $8 million from friends and family, and you know, define friends. So you know, it might be other angel investors, and you know, if you're in that network, a lot of people are your friends if you're a good founder, and you know, if you're not, you don't have any friends. So you know, it's a hard question to answer, but depending on how you define friends and family, a lot of these founders had access to large pools of capital from early angel investors. That's probably one good way to put it. Yes. Yeah, so question is, what did I find that was most counterintuitive, most surprising? Competition. So a lot of times we think that, you know, when founders come and pitch, they want to position their company as if we have no competition. You know, open space. Nobody has ever done this, right? And it turns out that's the story of only 15% of unicorns. 85% of successful companies had competitors from day one. Half of those 85%, their competitors are big companies. It will be Google's today. It would be, you know, at a time it might have been Oracle or Cisco. Today, those are Facebook, that's Google. So a lot of these companies had big competitors when they started. That on its own is not necessarily a good thing. The fact that you're nimble and small startup and you can find a good veg in a niche, that you can go in deep and create a product that's much better than anybody else at this point, even better than Google, even better than Facebook. That's, you know, what enabled them to succeed and build on it and go on, you know, what Instagram did to Facebook, what a lot of companies would do to Instagram at this point. So that's what kind of, you know, was very counterintuitive to me, that, you know, 85% of these companies had competitors, and yet everybody wants to come and say nobody is doing this. Question from Ray: are we in a unicorn bubble? If so, where are we going from here? That's a good question. There definitely is a valuation. I wouldn't necessarily call it a bubble, but there's a ton of companies that have raised a lot of money at very high valuations. But now let me tell you about the venture capital mentality, right? The way we invest, the way venture capital works is you invest in 10 companies, and of those 10 companies, 5 die, 3 of them return 1x, and 2 of them return your money 10x. And those 2 companies that return your money 10x is kind of paying up for all the failures, paying up for the 1x's, and it's going to 3x your whole fund and make your investors happy, make yourself happy. And if you look at it with that mentality, and that happens in every stage. If you're a seed investor, it happens, and you need the 50x return. Or if you're a Series A investor, and there's some gross investors that invest in a company and value it at $1 billion with the hope that it will be a $10 billion company. Now, even of those $1 billion companies, a few of them will die, will lose that unicorn status, right? And everybody in the press would laugh at them. Hey, look at this investor. Oh, hey, this company failed, haha. But that's baked in the model. A lot of these unicorns are supposed to die. A lot of those investors are supposed to lose their money. Very bad for the employees, very bad for the founders, but it's not something that to be mocked or to be talked badly on press. Hey, this founder failed very bad. This happens. This startup story, and this is a cycle. So yes, there's a lot of unicorns that don't deserve the valuation that they have. And because there's a lot of money lying around, because interest rates were low, there was a lot of cheap capital, there was a lot of funding, a lot of those valuations are not justified. But again, the valuation in startups is not inherently tied to their current state. It's tied to their potential that, can one of these 10 companies that I invest return a 10x for me or not? So a lot of these unicorns, they're not worth $1 billion. It just means one investor took a chance that this company would 10x me from 1 billion to 10 billion. It doesn't mean this company is worth $1 billion. One person valued it, took that chance. That's what it means. What problems are you most interested in solving today? So at DCVC, we're deep tech investors. So we care about deep engineering and kind of global scale problems. So that would be solving the problem with water scarcity, agriculture, climate change, food, creating enough food for people, solving the water problem, all the way to aerospace, therapies, robotics. There's a lot of deep hard problems in manufacturing, in supply chain that needs to get solved, and unfortunately not enough people are solving those problems. So those are the kind of things that we would be interested in. Question, what would you suggest a founder who has an investor who wants to invest for a percentage of ownership and the founder does not want to give up any percent of ownership? Well, you either want to invest or not. It's a business. So, there's a good number of companies that have succeeded by bootstrapping, by, being slower, taking the profits in, reinvesting those into hiring. GitHub did that for 4 years, and the first financing round that they had was at $100 million valuation. There's a lot of examples of that. Companies bootstrapping, not taking investor money, doing that and becoming successful. So that's one way to build companies. A lot of very successful companies never took investor money, right? They became public, very good companies. Among tech unicorn startups, obviously, we're talking about unicorns and some investors putting a valuation of $1 billion on your company. 90-something% of them were invested by investors. So you're playing two different games. In the venture business, you keep raising money, you keep going on the valuation, you keep hiring money. You're being forced on taking more risk. You're being forced to take on these challenges that might bankrupt the whole company, even at a later stage. And that's that's why it's called venture capital. And then there's a simpler way to build a company. That's you're taking it slower. You don't take on risk that would bankrupt the whole company, and you'll just take the profits, reinvest it, and grow organically. And both of them are two very different ways of building a company. And it's probably less about if you want to give ownership to an investor. It's more about if you want to give control to an investor. If you want to give up just your thought process and your path, because you build a personal company for yourself and you sell it for $10 million and you own the whole thing. That's life-changing. That's great. You own a startup and investors invest $10 million and you sell that for $10 million. Nothing. You have to go work for the next company for nothing, just return investor money. So there's a lot of very different paths that these two options are taking you. Would you suggest using a Kickstarter type of app as a way to get funds or go straight to VCs? So Kickstarter, specifically Kickstarter and Indiegogo, they're for product crowdfunding, right? So if you have a product, you go and you pre-sell that. I think that's fantastic that you can get on some pre-sales and you can see if there's demand for your product. It's very different from equity crowdfunding, where you're selling equity to the crowd. We have seen some successful examples, but still not enough. Still 99.9% of these successful companies get funded by traditional venture capitalists. They go the traditional route because you need a lot of money. These massive billion-dollar companies have raised hundreds of millions of dollars to get to the point that they were. Some of them billions of dollars, right? You can never do that via crowdfunding, or not never at this point, not at some point with crypto, a lot of different things that may happen. But I would still recommend doing the proper thing. Hiring great people, working on an ambitious problem, going to real VCs. This is a hard thing. Pick something big and do it properly. You're good? Okay. Thank you so much for coming today. I hope this was useful, and thank you again.